Welcome to our session titled Competitive and Functional Strategies within the framework of the strategy building of a firm. My name is Mario Glowik, and you will find the content discussed here in more detail to read in chapter 3 of the book Global Strategy in the Service Industries. Major aims of this session are that we should be able to explain competitive strategies and functional strategies of a firm and how to develop a strategic fit in between relevant strategic alternatives in order to gain a competitive advantage. So in this session, we talk about this part, competitive strategy, and this part, functional strategy. Both follow the directional strategy decision of the top management level, which is explained in a separate session available at YouTube. So let's start talking about the competitive strategies. Here the basic question is how we should compete. That means that question follows the top management decision on directional strategic level where we should compete. Porter defines 3 competitive generic strategies: cost leadership, differentiation, and niche strategies, realized in the firm's strategic business unit SPU. So let's start with the cost leadership strategy. In this case, the management targets cost-efficient value-adding activities, mainly through economies of scale and experience curve effects, which are ideally combined with a high bargaining power of the firm. Therefore, cost leaders aim to learn from the mistakes of other firms, for example, technological innovators. And the cost leaders often do business in rather mature markets, which indicate a high market volumes, but rather marginal growth rates. And therefore, usually the competition is based on the price in these mature markets. For that reason, in order to save costs, cost leaders usually offer standardized products and services in these markets. Opposite to cost leadership, there's a differentiation strategy. In this case, the management targets to differentiate its products and service from its competitors, for example, through technological innovation, an outstanding service, and an excellent quality, for example. So for that reason, products and services usually sold at higher levels than average market price. And then third, there's a niche strategy within the framework of competitive strategies. In case of niche strategy, cost aspects as well as differentiation elements are combined, targeting rather small and separated markets. There's a critic available you can find in the literature, because there's a nebulous borderline in between how much differentiation and how much cost awareness the firm's management should take into consideration. And therefore, Porter further developed his concept of generic competitive strategies and added later a niche strategy with differentiation focus, or alternatively, there's a possibility of launching a niche strategy with a cost focus within the framework of competitive strategies. However, we should be aware of conceptual weaknesses. So the first weakness is that there are potential segmentation drawbacks concerning cost elements and differentiation elements, because the firm's management always needs to consider both sides. So, for example, a cost leader should not ignore the quality and service activities, whereas a differentiator, of course, has to take care, has to monitor for the costs. Nevertheless, we should rather emphasize on the focus in both cases. That means cost leaders focus on costs, but of course they should not ignore elements to differentiate. For example, the quality, for example, differentiators focus on the issue how to differentiate products and services from its competitors without losing its awareness monitoring the costs. Nevertheless, the concept of generic strategies is characterized by a relatively high complexity, and therefore it is difficult to quantify important variables, and thus empirical verification is difficult. Nevertheless, there's absolutely no doubt, despite its conceptual weaknesses, Porter's generic strategies enjoy a really high level of publicity, especially among business practitioners. Okay, so let's start talking about functional strategies. Let me move back. So we are here. That's the third level. Here we deal with the departments such as human resource, accounting, purchasing, research and development, operations and marketing department. And in case of functional strategies, the basic question is how we should implement what was decided on directional and competitive level at earlier stages of the strategy decision process. So the firm's management needs to decide on the appropriate strategy mix on the functional department level. Therefore, functional strategy implements and realizes directional strategies and generic strategies by maximizing firm internal resource strengths, targeting sustainable competitive advantages. Let's take an example of strategic functional alternatives available in the purchasing department, marketing department, research and development, and operations department. In the purchasing department, we distinguish single sourcing, parallel sourcing, and multiple sourcing strategies. In case of single sourcing strategy, there's just one supplier available for the firm which delivers the required components necessary for own manufacturing. The advantage comes along with the fact that we can place our whole procurement volume for that particular component to this one single supplier. Nevertheless, the disadvantage or the huge disadvantage also comes along with the fact that we are really dependent on that single supplier in case that single supplier doesn't want or is not willing or is not able to deliver the required components. For that reason, many firms prefer parallel sourcing. In addition to one major supplier, they contract a second or third supplier, which helps them reducing the dependency on that one single supplier. But on the other hand, the entire procurement volume has to be divided in between one or two or three suppliers, which means each supplier will get a lower delivery volume, which may result in a reduced bargaining power of us. So therefore, suppliers might be not able or might be not willing to offer relatively attractive price because they have to deliver only in relatively small volume, which is particularly the case for multiple sourcing strategies when our entire procurement volume for one particular product is divided in between various suppliers. Then each supplier gets a lower delivery volume, which may result in a lower bargaining power and higher procurement prices. But the big advantage comes along that the firm can make use of various suppliers, which reduces the dependency on each supplier. On the other hand, contracting efforts, negotiation efforts, information complexity increases the more suppliers we have on board. Okay, in marketing, we distinguish, for example, when we talk about pricing strategies in between penetration and skimming strategies. In case of skimming, the management targets to launch the product at relatively high price levels. And in course of time, then the price is reduced incrementally. Whereas in case of penetration strategies, the management targets to launch its product or service at relatively low, relatively attractive prices in its international markets, hoping to generate economies of scale and economies of scope effects. And then there's another alternative or other alternatives available concerning the communication strategy. Push means the firm targets to push through the product and service through its distribution channels, for example, through a relatively aggressive advertising the price, advertising a very attractive price, whereas in case of a pull strategy, the management aims to develop a certain desire among potential customers, raise attention, not focusing on the price, raise attention and desire to buy that product and service. And then last but not least, there are timing strategies available in the marketing department related to functional strategies. For example, shower strategy, which means the firm's management targets to serve all possible markets right from the beginning of the product launch, hoping to generate economies of scale effects, whereas a waterfall strategy claims that the one market by another market should be entered. A waterfall strategy comes along with the advantage to make sure that each individual market is served best in terms of the customer treatment, distribution channels, marketing campaigns. But on the other hand, particularly in industries which indicate a relatively short product and technology life cycle, the firm's competitors may act faster in the target markets. So the waterfall strategy comes along with the risk of losing market potentials, market sales, which is not the case for the shower strategy. So the shorter the product life cycle and technology life cycle, for example, in electronics industries, the more recommendable is the shower strategy. Pharmaceutical industry, for example, drug sales serve as an ideal example from my point of view when talking about waterfall strategies, because in each market Usually the pharmaceutical company has to go through an approval process in order to get the confirmation selling that drug. And by the way, the waterfall strategy and the Uppsala concept of internationalization, which is also available at YouTube, they have a lot of common characteristics. And then there's a research and development department. Here we basically distinguish in between technological leadership and technological followership strategy. Technological leader aim to launch products and services which are innovative. They seek to reach innovative customers who wish to buy state-of-the-art products and services, whereas technological follower aim to learn from the mistake of the innovators. They are often located at later stages of the product life cycle, and therefore prices tend to be rather low. And then there are alternatives at the firm's operations department. So, for example, we distinguish in between individual order or serial or mass production. Individual order, as the term indicates, for example, there's one especially engineered, especially designed machinery, which is only available once. And then there's a serial or mass production. Serial production is common in automotive industry or electronics industries, and mass production deals with products such as nails, for example. Okay, having above mentioned in mind, the aim is to gain competitive advantage. And competitive advantage is reached when there's a strategic fit developed by the management in between all three levels. That means directional, competitive, and functional level. So that is the reason why the strategic fit is the reason why some firms perform better in terms of its sales and profits, and why other firms which do not develop the strategic fit in between all three levels perform less than expectations. So, for example, in case of a growth strategy, through concentration and cost leadership, requires functional strategies for the marketing department, such as a push strategy. Push through the products and services through the market, and this should be combined with a shower strategy, meaning serve as much as possible markets right from the beginning, and this should be combined with a penetration strategy. Sell the products and services as most attractive prices. Please don't say cheap prices. Let's say most attractive, most reasonable prices. Nobody wants to be cheap. Also, cost leaders don't want to be cheap. But when they combine all three in an appropriate manner, then cost leaders have best prerequisites to generate profits, because when the push strategy, shower, and penetration strategy is combined, it provides best prerequisites for generating economies of scale and economies of scope effects for the firm. This figure serves as an overview in order to find the appropriate strategic fit in between the directional level, competitive level, and functional level. So, for example, the firm launches a growth strategy through cost leadership. Then in the marketing department, as we have previously discussed, penetration pricing, push strategy, shower strategy is recommendable, aiming mass markets worldwide. You should keep in mind that cost leaders often launch their products and services at the mature stage of the product life cycle, and cost leaders, because they have to generate economies of scale and scope effects, usually run large operations facilities, plants, so therefore they are confronted with relatively high fixed cost burdens, which may lead to aggressive pricing behavior. When launching a cost leadership in the operations department, it is recommendable to launch a serial or mass production. Unique or single production is not recommendable. Cost leaders aim to minimize line switching in terms of the products. They aim at maximal output. They have to feed large manufacturing capacities, hoping to maximize economies of scale and scope effects. In case of cost leadership strategy, a technological followership strategy is more recommendable than leadership. Learn from the other mistakes. And therefore, suppose licensing is possible, that means another firm is willing and ready to sell its license, then licensing is more recommendable than own elementary research and own patenting, because cost leaders mainly conduct research in order to increase efficiency in the production lines and component standardization. In case of purchasing, when implementing a cost leadership strategy, parallel and multiple sourcing is more recommendable than single sourcing in order to minimize the dependency on the suppliers. Supplier selection is driven by price, and the bargaining power comes along with the fact that cost leaders usually place orders with rather large purchase volumes, and therefore cost leaders aim to place large standardized purchase lots instead of small quantities and purchase lots frequently changing. In case of accounting, the firm launching a cost leadership strategy usually launches standardized planning, and the management pays attention on a strict monitoring of cost inputs, outputs, and efficiency. And therefore, in HR department, the management by objective targets to focus on costs, efficiency, and sales volume. The recruitment department tends to launch rather standardized recruitment procedures, because cost leaders are often organized through mechanistic, hierarchical organizations and the corresponding working philosophy. Opposite to cost leaders, differentiators. In case of human resource, the management by objectives tend to focus on idea generation, innovation, customer satisfaction is first, and overall contribution to the firm's reputation. And differentiators often make use of less hierarchical working philosophy. Instead, they focus on idea generation and an open communication style. In case of accounting, opposite to cost leaders, differentiators prefer flexible planning, for example, through project financing, and their focus on monitoring of earnings and spendings instead of just monitoring the costs. The more differentiated the product, the more recommendable it is to consider parallel or even single sourcing. Let's suppose there's just one or two highly sophisticated suppliers available, depending on the degree of differentiation the management is looking for. So that is sometimes the differentiator cannot avoid, particularly if the product is placed at the beginning stage of the product life cycle. Today, for example, electric car manufacturers are confronted with the fact that appropriate battery suppliers are not available in the global markets. So that's why, for example, Tesla decided to use Panasonic's batteries as their single suppliers. That means also the dependency is very high. Okay, the supplier selection in case of a differentiation strategy is mainly driven by the supplier's expertise and knowledge, instead of just looking for the price and costs. And differentiators often make use of flexible pressure slots. Differentiators often make use of a technological leadership strategy, trying to be the true innovator in the market. Permanent product and service pioneering is important, and therefore patenting rather than licensing is recommendable because research focuses on new innovation techniques and components. Concerning operations, single and serial production is more recommendable than mass production because differentiators often target separate customer segments, trying to sell highly differentiated products and services depending on the customer's segment expectation. And therefore, in many cases, a flexible line switching is important at the firm side in order to meet the customers' often changing orders. So the philosophy at operations is customer order first and economies of scale second. That's why there's no other need, or there's no other possibility for differentiators to launch a skim pricing strategy, individual pricing. They cannot sell the products at the very bottom price level if they have to meet all the other requirements, if they have just one or two or three suppliers available. And that is then ideally combined with a pull strategy, raise attention among your customer groups, serve individual customers instead of mass markets, and therefore waterfall strategy is more recommendable in case of differentiation than shower strategy. Of course, always keep in mind it's important to know in which industry the company launches its business. In electronics industry, smartphone business, for example, it is not easy to launch a waterfall strategy because product life cycles, the model changes so often. And last but not least, in case of a differentiation strategy, the products and services are often launched at the introduction phase of the product life cycle instead of later stages, and that provides best prerequisites to sell its products and services at higher price levels, combined ideally with a pull strategy, raise attention among the customers. This is the literature recommendable for going through the subject of generic strategies as developed by Porter. So, thank you so much for watching, and I wish you most possible success in your academic studies or in business, and hope to see you soon in another session. Thank you so much.